The bloodstain wouldn't come out. Clara Wynne pressed harder, her 10-year-old hands raw and shaking as she scrubbed the saloon floor at midnight. Above her boots thudded, laughter crashed like breaking glass. She made herself smaller, invisible, the way children learn when being seen means being hurt. 3 months since she'd run from the territorial orphanage. 3 months of sleeping in corners, eating scraps, working until her fingers bled. One mistake, and they'd drag her back to that place where children disappeared into mine shafts, and nobody asked questions. But someone was watching. If you're ready to discover how one invisible girl changed an entire town, stay with me until the end. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. The Desert Rose Saloon squatted at the edge of Silver Creek like a vulture on a fence post, all peeling paint and broken promises. 3 stories of warped timber that leaned slightly west, as if trying to pull away from the respectable buildings on Main Street. In the autumn of 1887, it was the kind of place decent folk crossed the street to avoid, where the territorial judges drank away their ethics and the mining company bosses bought silence with whiskey and gold. Clara had learned every inch of those floors. She knew which boards creaked, which corners held the worst filth, which rooms upstairs made sounds she tried not to understand. At 10 years old, she'd become a ghost in a building full of ghosts. Small enough to slip through crowds, quiet enough that grown men forgot she existed until they needed something cleaned or fetched or disposed of. That's what they called her. The disposal girl. The nickname had started as a joke. Now it was simply true. She disposed of their mess, their vomit and blood and broken glass, their secrets spilled in drunken confession, their violence absorbed into scrub brushes and rags, wrung out into buckets of water that ran pink and brown and sometimes black in the pre-dawn darkness. "Girl, get over here!" Wade Hutchins' voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. Clara's hand stilled on the mop handle, every muscle in her small body tensing. The saloon owner stood behind the bar, his thick arms crossed, his face flushed with the particular shade of red that meant someone was about to pay for something. She moved quickly, keeping her eyes down. The crowd parted around her, cowboys still dusty from the trail, card players hunched over their hands. The painted ladies who worked the upper rooms and pretended not to see a child working past midnight. "Yes, sir?" "Table 4 just left, cleaning, now." She nodded and hurried toward the corner table, her bare feet silent on the sticky floor. Her shoes had worn through 2 weeks ago. Hutchins said she'd have to earn new ones. Table 4 was worse than usual. Plain cards scattered across a surface slick with spilled whiskey, cigar ash ground into the wood, and blood. Not much, just a few drops where someone's poker game had turned violent, but enough that she'd need to scrub hard, and scrubbing hard meant her hands would crack open again, and cracked hands meant infection if she wasn't careful. She was always careful now. Clara gathered the cards first, stacking them with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this task 1,000 times. Then the glasses, crusted with residue. The ashtray, heavy and reeking. She loaded everything onto the tray that was almost as big as her torso and carried it to the back room, her thin arms shaking with the weight. The kitchen was marginally better than the main room, at least it was quieter. The cook, a Chinese man named Lin, who'd lost his left hand in a mining accident, glanced up from the pot he was scrubbing. "You eat today?" he asked in his careful English. Clara shook her head. There hadn't been time. There was never time. Lin pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from beneath the counter and pushed it toward her. "Bread, cheese, eat fast before Hutchins see." Her throat tightened. "I can't take your—" "Not mine. Customer left, already paid for." It was a lie they both understood. Lin did this sometimes, claiming food was left over when Clara knew he'd set it aside deliberately. "Eat. You too skinny. Fall down dead. Who cleaned the floors?" The attempt at humor made her smile despite everything. She unwrapped the bundle with reverent hands and bit into bread that was still warm, cheese that was real and not molded. The food hit her empty stomach like a blessing. She ate quickly, mechanically, the way she did everything now, fast enough that it couldn't be taken away. "Thank you," she whispered. Lin just nodded and returned to his scrubbing. Kindness here was currency too precious to acknowledge openly. Clara finished eating and returned to the main room with her bucket and brush. The blood on table 4 required her full attention. She knelt beside it, dipping her brush in the harsh lye soap that made her hands burn, and began the familiar motion. Scrub, rinse. Scrub again. Watch the pink water swirl in the bucket. Try not to think about whose blood it was. What violence had spilled it. Make yourself small. Make yourself invisible. That's what kept you alive. That child shouldn't be working here at this hour. The voice cut through the saloon's chaos like a knife through smoke, deep, calm, carrying the kind of authority that made drunk men straighten their spines. Clara's hands stilled on the brush. She knew that voice. Sheriff Elias Crow stood just inside the saloon doors, his tall frame backlit by the street lamps outside. He was in his late 30s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard years and harder choices. His badge caught the lamplight, but it was his eyes that drew attention, gray as storm clouds, and just as unforgiving when they settled on something unjust. Those eyes were fixed on Clara. "Sheriff?" Hutchins' voice oozed false courtesy as he emerged from behind the bar. "Didn't expect law enforcement tonight. Everything's peaceful here." "Is it?" Elias's gaze never left the small figure kneeling beside the blood-stained table. "What's that child's name?" "That? That's just Clara, orphan girl, does odd jobs for room and board." "Odd jobs?" Elias finally looked at Hutchins, and something in his expression made the larger man step back. "At midnight, on her knees, scrubbing blood." "She's got nowhere else to go, Sheriff. I'm doing her a kindness, giving her work and a place to sleep. You know how it is with these orphan kids. They'd starve without honest employment." The word honest seemed to hang in the air, rotting. Elias crossed the room in 5 long strides. He stopped beside Clara's table and crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the weariness that lived in a lawman who'd seen too much. "What's your name, child?" Clara's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Clara Wynne, sir." "How old are you, Clara?" 10, sir. Almost 11. "When did you last eat a full meal?" The question caught her off guard. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen, then back to the floor. I eat, sir." "That wasn't what I asked." Silence stretched between them. In the background, the saloon had gone quiet. Even the card players were watching now, sensing the shift in the room's temperature. "How much is he paying you?" Elias asked quietly. "I get room and board, sir. Mr. Hutchins is very generous." "Where do you sleep?" Clara hesitated. The storage room behind the kitchen wasn't really a room, more of a closet with a dirt floor and a single blanket. But it was dry, and it was hers, and it was better than the street. "I have a place, sir." Elias studied her for a long moment. Then he straightened and turned to face Hutchins. "I want to see her sleeping quarters, and her work contract." Hutchins' face flushed deeper. "Now hold on, Sheriff. I don't need to show you. You're employing a minor child. Past midnight. In an establishment that serves alcohol. I have every legal right to inspect the working conditions." Elias's voice remained calm, but something in it made men reach for weapons they weren't carrying. "Unless you'd prefer I come back with federal marshals and inspect everything else you're running here." The threat landed like a thunderclap. Hutchins' jaw worked, grinding through options. Finally, he jerked his head toward the back. "Fine. Look all you want. You'll see I'm running a legitimate business here." Clara watched them disappear through the kitchen door, her heart hammering. She'd never seen anyone stand up to Hutchins like that. Never seen anyone in authority look at her like she was something more than a convenience, a tool, a thing to be used and discarded. It terrified her, because protection was just another kind of attention, and attention was dangerous. Attention meant being seen, and being seen meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant being hurt. She'd learned that lesson in blood and bruises at the territorial orphanage. "That girl's going to bring trouble down on us all." The muttered comment came from one of the card players, a ranch hand named Decker, who'd been known to get violent when he was losing. His companions nodded agreement. Clara's hands began shaking. She dipped the brush back in the bucket and scrubbed harder, trying to make herself disappear into the work. If Hutchins got in trouble with the law, he'd blame her. If the sheriff started asking too many questions, someone would send word to the territorial authorities. And if the territorial authorities came looking, her hand stilled on the brush as the memory hit her, vivid and unavoidable. The orphanage. Stone walls and iron bars, children lined up at dawn, sorted by size and strength. The healthy ones sent to the mines or the ranches, leased out like livestock. The weak ones. Nobody talked about what happened to the weak ones. Clara had been weak, small, sickly from malnutrition and infected lungs. Not worth the cost of feeding, the matron had said. Not worth keeping. She'd overheard them talking late one night. The matron and a man in a fine suit who'd come from the territorial capital. They'd been discussing disposal of defective inventory. The phrase had burned itself into Clara's memory. She'd understood enough to know that disposal didn't mean finding her a home, so she'd run. Stolen a horse blanket and a canteen, slipped through a broken fence, and disappeared into the desert night. 3 days of walking. 3 days of sun that baked her skin and cold that froze her bones. 3 days of thinking she'd die out there in the sage and sand. Then Silver Creek had appeared on the horizon like a mirage. The Desert Rose had been the first building she'd stumbled into, half dead from thirst and exposure. Hutchins had found her collapsed near the back door. He'd given her water, food, a place to sleep, and in exchange all she had to do was work. It had seemed like salvation at the time. Now, 3 months later, she understood it was just a different kind of cage. The kitchen door swung open. Elias emerged first, his face carved from granite. Hutchins followed, his expression somewhere between furious and frightened. "Clara." The sheriff's voice was gentle, but it held steel underneath. "I need you to come with me." Terror spiked through her chest. "I didn't do anything wrong. You're not in trouble." Elias crouched again, meeting her eyes. "But you can't stay here. Not like this." "I have to!" The words burst out before she could stop them. "I have nowhere else. Please, I'll work harder. I'll be better. Child. Something in his voice stopped her panic. "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" Clara blinked. "A doctor?" "For your hands, your feet, that cough I heard when you were scrubbing." She looked down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. The cracks and calluses, the chemical burns, the way her fingers trembled even when she tried to hold them still. They didn't look like a child's hands anymore. "I don't need a doctor," she whispered. "I'm fine. You're 10 years old, working past midnight in a saloon, sleeping in a storage closet with no bedding, eating scraps when someone remembers to feed you." Elias's voice remained steady, but something burned beneath the calm. "That's not fine. That's not even close to fine." Hutchins stepped forward, his massive hands clenched. "Now you wait just 1 minute, Sheriff. That girl signed a work contract, legal and binding. She owes me for 3 months of room and board, and until that debt is paid—" "Show me the contract." "What?" "The legal, binding contract you claim exists. Show it to me, now." Hutchins' mouth opened and closed. Around them, the saloon had gone dead silent. Even the piano player had stopped, his hands frozen above the keys. It's in my office. I'll fetch it tomorrow." "No." Elias stood, and suddenly he seemed to fill the room. "You'll fetch it now, because if a legal contract exists, it needs to be witnessed and notarized. It needs to specify working conditions, hours, compensation, and terms of debt repayment. And—" his voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "It needs to explain how you got a 10-year-old child to sign away her freedom when territorial law requires parental or guardian consent for any labor contract involving a minor." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara watched Hutchins' face cycle through expressions: anger, calculation, fear. She'd seen that same progression before, usually right before someone got hurt. "Unless," Elias continued, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, "no such contract exists. In which case, you've been using an orphan child for unpaid labor under the guise of charity, which is illegal, immoral, and something I will not tolerate in my jurisdiction." "Your jurisdiction?" Hutchins found his voice, and with it, his courage. "You think wearing that badge gives you the right to interfere with private business? I got friends in the territorial capital, Sheriff. Important friends. You start making trouble for legitimate businessmen, you'll find yourself out of a job faster than call them." Elias's voice cut through the bluster like a blade. Call your friends in the Capitol. Tell them Sheriff Crow is interfering with your legitimate business. See if they want to explain to a federal judge why they're protecting child labor exploitation. The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Hutchins' face had gone from red to purple. His hands shook with rage or fear, or both. You're making a mistake, Crow. A big one. The only mistake would be walking away. Elias turned back to Clara, and his voice gentled. Clara, I'm offering you a choice. You can stay here, keep working under these conditions. That's your right. Or you can come with me, and we'll find you somewhere safe, somewhere you can be a child instead of unpaid labor. Clara's world narrowed to that moment, that choice. She looked at Hutchins, whose expression promised retribution. She looked at the saloon, the only shelter she'd known for 3 months. She looked at her hands, raw and bleeding. Then she looked at Elias Crow and saw something she hadn't seen in so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Someone who saw her. Not as disposal, not as property, not as a problem to be solved or a tool to be used, just as a person, a child. Someone who deserved better. I'll go with you, she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they changed everything. Elias nodded once. Get your things. I don't have any things. Something flickered across his face. Anger or grief or both. Then we'll go. He placed a hand on her shoulder, light and careful, and guided her toward the door. Behind them, Hutchins sputtered threats and curses. The card players muttered. The painted ladies watched with expressions Clara couldn't read, but none of them moved to stop the sheriff. They stepped out into the night, and the cool desert air hit Clara's face like a benediction. Above them, stars scattered across the black sky and numbers beyond counting. The street was empty except for a few tied horses and the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle. Where are we going? Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. Elias was quiet for a moment, as if he'd only just realized he'd committed to something he hadn't fully planned. For tonight, my office has a holding cell with a clean cot. Tomorrow, we'll figure out something better. A cell? Fear spiked through her exhaustion. Not for you, he said quickly. I'm not arresting you, Clara. I'm protecting you. There's a difference. They walked in silence down Main Street, past the closed general store and the dark windows of the bank. Silver Creek was a typical territorial town. Wide streets designed for cattle drives, false front buildings painted in optimistic colors, enough churches to forgive a multitude of sins. At night, with most of the honest folk sleeping, it showed its other face. The gambling halls and brothels, the all-night saloons, the places where the law was more suggestion than rule. The sheriff's office sat at the intersection of Main and Silver, a squat stone building that had been there longer than most of the town. Lamplight glowed in one window. Elias opened the door and ushered Clara inside. The office was spare but clean, a desk piled with paperwork, a gun cabinet, a pot-bellied stove radiating gentle heat. And in the back, behind iron bars, 2 holding cells. Sam, Elias addressed a young deputy who'd been dozing at the desk. I need you to run an errand. The deputy, barely 20, with the kind of eager face that suggested he still believed in justice, scrambled to attention. Yes, sir? Go to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Tell her I need linens, a pillow, and whatever food she has prepared for tomorrow's breakfast. Tell her it's urgent, and I'll pay double her usual rate. Sam's eyes flicked to Clara, taking in her bare feet and ragged dress and the way she held herself, ready to bolt or disappear. Something like understanding crossed his young face. Right away, Sheriff. He grabbed his hat and departed at a near run. Elias moved to the stove and poured water from a kettle into a tin basin. He carried it to the desk along with a clean cloth. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair. Clara perched on the edge, her body rigid with uncertainty. Let me see your hands. She extended them slowly, palms up. In the lamplight, the damage was stark. Cracked skin, chemical burns, calluses that shouldn't exist on a child's hands. Elias's jaw tightened, but his touch was gentle as he dipped the cloth in the warm water and began cleaning away the grime and dried blood. Clara flinched at first, expecting pain, but his movements were careful, methodical, almost reverent. My wife used to tell me that hands tell a person's story, he said quietly, not looking up from his work. These hands tell me you've been surviving, fighting, working harder than any child should have to work. He finally met her eyes. But survival isn't the same as living, Clara. You understand that? She didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded. He finished cleaning her hands and moved to her feet, which were in even worse condition, cut, bruised, crusted with dirt and dried blood. He worked in silence, his weathered hands impossibly gentle, and Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Kindness was the most dangerous thing of all, because kindness made you hope, and hope made you weak. And weakness got you sent back to the orphanage, or worse. Why are you doing this? The question escaped before she could stop it. Elias looked up, and for the first time, she saw past the badge and the authority to the person underneath, someone who carried his own scars, his own losses. I had a daughter once, he said simply. She'd be about your age now. Died of scarlet fever when she was 7. My wife followed 6 months later. Couldn't live with the grief. He returned his attention to Clara's feet. Every time I see a child in trouble, I think about Sarah, about how I couldn't save her, can't save her, but maybe I can save someone else's daughter. The raw honesty of it stole Clara's breath. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be sorry. Just be alive. Be a child. Let someone take care of you for once. The door burst open and Sam returned, arms loaded with linens and a basket that smelled like heaven. Mrs. Patterson herself followed, a round woman in her 50s with the kind of face that suggested she'd seen everything and judged nothing. Elias Crow, what have you gotten yourself into now? But her voice was warm, and her eyes were kind as they landed on Clara. Oh, sweetheart, let's get you fed and clean, shall we? The next hour passed in a blur of warm food and clean water and soft blankets. Mrs. Patterson produced a nightgown that had belonged to her granddaughter, and helped Clara wash away 3 months of accumulated grime. The holding cell transformed under her efficient hands, fresh linens on the cot, a pillow that smelled like lavender, a quilt that was worn but clean. Clara ate stew and fresh bread and drank milk that wasn't sour or watered down. Her stomach cramped at first, unused to being full, but she forced herself to eat slowly, to savor every bite. When she was finally clean and fed and dressed in the borrowed nightgown, Mrs. Patterson tucked her into the cot like a child instead of a burden. You sleep now, honey. Sheriff Crow will keep you safe. But what happens tomorrow? Clara's voice was small, frightened. What if Mr. Hutchins comes? What if the territorial authorities, tomorrow, we'll worry about tomorrow? Elias stood in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by lamplight. Tonight, you sleep. No one's taking you anywhere, you have my word. And somehow, impossibly, Clara believed him. She lay down on the cot, surrounded by softness she'd almost forgotten existed. Through the bars of the cell, bars that locked others out, not her in, she could see Elias return to his desk, could hear the scratch of his pen on paper, filing reports she would learn later, starting the legal process to claim emergency guardianship, drawing a line in the sand between a child and the people who'd see her destroyed. But in that moment, Clara just closed her eyes and let herself feel something she hadn't felt since before the orphanage, before the running, before the survival. Safe. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Wynne fell asleep without fear. Outside, the desert night settled over Silver Creek like a blanket. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. In the Desert Rose Saloon, Wade Hutchins poured himself another drink and considered his options, all of them violent. And somewhere in the territorial capital, in offices where power was bought and sold like livestock, officials began receiving urgent telegrams about a small-town sheriff who'd forgotten his place. The storm was coming. Clara just didn't know it yet. But Elias Crow knew. He'd been through storms before, had the scars to prove it. As he sat at his desk in the pre-dawn darkness, filling out forms that might cost him his badge or worse, he thought about his daughter, about his wife, about all the children he'd failed to save, and he made himself a promise. This one would be different. This one would live. This one would have the chances Sarah never got, even if it cost him everything. The pen scratched across paper. Outside, the sky began to lighten toward dawn, and in the holding cell, Clara Wynne slept the dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted, her small body finally allowed to rest. The invisible girl had been seen at last. Now the real fight could begin. Morning came soft and golden through the sheriff's office window, landing on Clara's face like a question she wasn't ready to answer. She woke with a start, her body jerking upright before her mind caught up, hands raised defensively before she remembered where she was. The holding cell, clean sheets, the smell of coffee instead of whiskey and stale smoke. Real. This was real. She sat on the edge of the cot, her bare feet touching cool stone floor instead of sticky saloon boards, and felt the strangeness of it settle into her bones. Through the iron bars, she could see Elias at his desk, already dressed and working through a stack of papers. The pot-bellied stove radiated warmth. Outside, Silver Creek was waking up, the sound of wagon wheels on packed dirt, someone calling out a greeting, the distant hammer of the blacksmith starting his day. Normal sounds. Morning sounds. Sounds that belonged to people who had homes and families and futures, not sounds for girls like her. "You're awake." Elias looked up from his paperwork, and something in his expression eased when he saw her. "How'd you sleep?" Clara's voice came out rough, unused. "I slept." "Good." He stood and moved to a small table near the stove where a tray sat covered with a cloth. "Mrs. Patterson sent breakfast. You hungry?" She was always hungry, but the question itself felt like a trap, like accepting food meant accepting obligation, accepting debt, accepting a chain that would eventually pull tight around her throat. Elias seemed to read the hesitation in her face. "It's just breakfast, Clara. No strings, no debt, just food because children need to eat." The simplicity of it undid something in her chest. She nodded. He brought the tray to the cell and unlocked the door, the scrape of metal on metal making her flinch, then set the food on the small table inside. Eggs. Toast with real butter. Sliced apples. A glass of milk so white it looked like paint. "Eat slow," he advised. "Your stomach's going to need time to adjust to regular meals." Clara picked up the fork with trembling hands and forced herself to eat carefully, methodically, even though every instinct screamed at her to devour it all before someone took it away. The eggs were warm and seasoned with pepper. The toast was soft. The apples were sweet and crisp. She was halfway through when the office door opened and a boy walked in. He was maybe 12 or 13, thin as a fence post, with dark hair that stuck up at odd angles and eyes that had seen too much too soon. His clothes were patched but clean, and he carried himself with the wary alertness of a stray dog who'd learned that humans could be kind or cruel in equal measure. Those eyes landed on Clara, and something passed between them, a recognition that needed no words. Survivor to survivor, the ones who'd learned to be invisible. "Sheriff?" The boy's voice was soft, uncertain. "Mrs. Patterson said you might. She said there was—" "Come in, Thomas." Elias's voice gentled the way it had with Clara. "Close the door." The boy, Thomas, did as he was told, his movements careful and controlled. He stood just inside the door like he might need to run at any moment. "This is Clara," Elias said. "Clara, this is Thomas Reed. Works at the livery stable." "Worked," Thomas corrected quietly. "Mr. Sutton let me go yesterday. Said business was slow." The lie was obvious in the way his hand unconsciously touched his ribs, in the fresh bruise darkening his cheekbone. Elias's jaw tightened. "He hit you." "I dropped a saddle, my fault." "You're 12 years old." 13, Thomas said, and there was pride in his voice despite everything. "Been on my own since I was 10. I can work. I just need—" His voice cracked. "I just need somewhere to go. Mrs. Patterson said maybe you could—" He trailed off, looking at Clara, at the cell that wasn't locked, at the food she was eating. Understanding dawned in his expression, followed by something like hope. Clara knew that look. She'd worn it herself when Hutchins had first offered her work, before she'd learned that help always came with hooks. But Elias was already moving, pulling out the chair at his desk, gesturing for Thomas to sit. "When did you last eat?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Silence. Then barely audible. "Day before yesterday." Elias looked at Clara. "Would you mind sharing?" It was the way he asked, not demanding, not taking, but asking permission as if her answer mattered, that made Clara push the tray toward Thomas without hesitation. There's plenty. Thomas ate like a starving animal, all pretense of control vanishing as soon as food touched his tongue. Clara watched him and saw herself, saw all the children she'd glimpsed at the orphanage, saw the vast invisible army of children surviving on scraps and silence. Elias watched too, his expression carved from stone, and Clara wondered what he was thinking. What calculations were running behind those storm-gray eyes? When Thomas finally slowed down, when his plate was empty and his glass drained, Elias spoke. "The livery stable isn't the only place that let you go, is it?" Thomas's shoulders hunched. "No, sir." "How many?" 3 jobs in 2 months. They all say the same thing. Business is slow, can't afford extra hands, but it's not—" He stopped himself. "Not about the money," Elias finished. "It's about you being an orphan, being alone, being someone they can hit when they're angry and fire when they're bored, because who's going to stop them?" The words hung in the air like an indictment. Thomas's voice came out small, ashamed. "Yes, sir." "Look at me, son." The boy raised his head slowly, expecting judgment. Instead, he found something else in the sheriff's face, something fierce and protective and absolutely unyielding. "That's not your fault," Elias said quietly. "None of it. You understand? The system that lets grown men abuse children isn't your fault. The town that looks away isn't your fault. The fact that you're 13 years old and sleeping in haylofts and going hungry isn't your fault." Thomas blinked rapidly, fighting tears. Clara knew that fight too, the desperate need to not break down, to not show weakness, because weakness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. "I can work," Thomas said again, and the words were almost a plea. "I'm strong. I learn fast. I just need a chance." "I know you can work. I've seen you at the livery. You're better with horses than most men twice your age." Elias leaned back in his chair. "But here's what I'm offering, and I need you to listen carefully. You can stay here, at the office, same as Clara, clean cot, regular meals, no hitting, no abuse. In exchange, I'll put you to work, but not the way Sutton did. You'll be my deputy assistant, help around the office, run errands, learn about law enforcement if you're interested, fair wages, proper hours, and the protection of this badge." Thomas stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do. Nobody does the right thing for free. I'm not nobody." Elias stood and moved to the window, looking out at Silver Creek coming to life. "And this isn't free. It's going to cost me plenty before it's done. Already has, but some things are worth the cost." Clara found her voice. "Mr. Hutchins will be angry." "Let him be angry. He has friends, important friends." "So do I." Elias turned back to face them, and Clara saw the lawman in him then, the man who'd sworn an oath and meant it, who'd pinned on a badge and made it mean something. And more importantly, I have something they don't. The law. Real law, not the territorial politicking that lets men like Hutchins exploit children. Federal law, constitutional law. The kind that says children have rights, even orphans, even the ones nobody wants. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "You really mean it? All of it?" "Every word." "And when the important people come? When they try to make trouble for you? Then they'll discover I'm not as easy to push around as they think." Something dangerous flickered in Elias's smile. "I've been a sheriff for 15 years, Thomas. Served in the territorial wars before that. Seen violence and corruption and every ugly thing humans do to each other. I'm still here, still wearing this badge. And I'll be damned if I let a bunch of suited bureaucrats tell me I can't protect children in my own jurisdiction." The office fell quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sounds of the town. Clara looked at Thomas, and Thomas looked back, and in that moment they shared a decision neither could fully articulate. Trust was dangerous. Trust was foolish. Trust was the thing that got you hurt. But sometimes you had to choose between certain death and possible salvation. "I'll stay," Thomas said. Elias nodded like he'd expected nothing else. "Good. Clara, you comfortable sharing space, or should I see about getting another—" "I don't mind sharing," Clara said quickly. The thought of being alone again, even in safety, made her chest tight. "Then it's settled." Elias moved to the gun cabinet and pulled out a ring of keys. Thomas, there's a storage room upstairs. Used to be deputy quarters before the town grew. It's dusty, but sound. You can both sleep up there instead of the cell. More space, windows that open, actual privacy. We'll get it cleaned up today. Today? Clara couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Today, Elias confirmed. Because you're not prisoners, and you're not charity cases. You're children who deserve a safe place to live. Now both of you finish eating while I make some arrangements. He settled at his desk and began writing, his pen scratching across paper with purposeful intensity. Clara and Thomas sat in the strange new silence, navigating the uncertain territory of shared circumstance. Neither quite knew what to say to the other. What do you tell someone who's survived the same things you've survived? How do you build trust when trust has been weaponized against you your whole life? It was Thomas who finally spoke. How long you been on your own? Since July, Clara said. Ran from the territorial orphanage. You? 3 years. My ma died of cholera. Never knew my pa. The orphanage wanted to send me to the copper mines in Utah. I ran before they could. The mines? Claire's voice dropped. I heard about those. They say boys go in and don't come out. Yeah. Thomas's hand touched his ribs again. That's what they say. More silence. Then Clara asked the question that had been burning in her throat. You think he means it? The sheriff? About protecting us? Thomas considered this carefully, his young face older than it should be. My grandma used to say you can tell a man's character by what he does when nobody's watching, when he don't have to. Sheriff Crow pulled you out of that saloon knowing it would cause him trouble. He's feeding me knowing I can't pay him back. That's not strategy. That's who he is. But everyone wants something. Maybe? Thomas shrugged. But maybe what he wants is to do right by kids who've been done wrong. That's so hard to believe? It was, actually. In Clara's experience, adults fell into 2 categories. The ones who hurt you and the ones who looked away while others did. A third category, someone who actively helped with no expectation of return, didn't fit into her understanding of how the world worked. But here she was, fed and clean and sitting in a place where the doors didn't lock from the outside. Here she was, talking to another child who'd survived impossible things. Here she was, watching a lawman write letters that would probably cost him everything, just to keep 2 orphans safe. Maybe the world was wider than her experience had taught her. The office door opened again, and this time it was Deputy Sam, his young face flushed from running. Sheriff, you need to come see this. Elias looked up, immediately alert. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong exactly. It's just, there's kids outside, a lot of kids. Clara and Thomas exchanged glances and followed Elias to the door. What they saw made Clara's breath catch in her throat. A dozen children stood in the street in front of the sheriff's office, maybe more, ranging from 6 or 7 years old up to 15 or 16. All of them had the same look, the wary eyes, the too thin frames, the clothes that were patched and mended and patched again. All of them stood with the particular stillness of young things who'd learned that movement attracted predators. At the front of the group stood a girl about Clara's age with red hair and freckles, holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. She stepped forward when she saw Elias, her chin lifted in defiance of her obvious fear. Sheriff Crow? Her voice carried despite its trembling. My name's Annie Murphy. Is it true what they're saying? That you're protecting orphan kids? That you're standing up to Mr. Hutchins and the territorial bosses? Elias descended the steps slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. It's true. Who told you? Everyone's talking about it. About the girl you took from the saloon. About how you filed papers and everything. Annie's grip tightened on the little boy's hand. Is there room for more? The question hit like a physical blow. Clara saw Elias's face transform, shock, grief, determination cycling through in rapid succession. He looked at the gathered children, really looked at them, and Clara knew he was seeing what she saw. The visible ones were bad enough, but how many more were hiding in the shadows? How many invisible children were surviving in Silver Creek's margins, waiting for someone to notice they were drowning? Where are you staying now? Elias asked Annie gently. Different places, haylofts, empty buildings. Wherever we can find that's dry and don't got rats. She gestured to the little boy beside her. This is my brother Danny. He's 5. Got the coughing sickness. I'm afraid he won't make it through winter if we're sleeping outside. The boy coughed on cue, a wet rattling sound that Clara recognized from the orphanage. Chest fever. Without treatment, without warmth and food and medicine, it would kill him before the snow melted. Elias crouched down to Danny's level. Hey there, son. That cough sounds pretty bad. How long you had it? Danny looked at his sister, who answered for him. 2 weeks. Getting worse. I tried to get the doctor to look at him, but he said we needed money up front. Did he now? Something cold entered Elias's voice. He straightened and looked at the assembled children. All of you, inside, now. We'll figure this out. They moved as a group, fluid and coordinated in the way that spoke of shared survival. Clara recognized it, the pack mentality that developed when children had only each other. They filed into the office, filling it beyond capacity, and stood waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because shoes always dropped. Adults always found reasons why they couldn't help, why it wasn't their problem, why you should just be grateful for whatever scraps they deigned to offer. But Elias just looked at them with that same fierce protectiveness Clara had seen earlier and said, First things first, anyone here not eaten breakfast? 11 hands went up. Sam, run to the hotel. Tell them I need food for 15. Full meals. Charge it to the sheriff's office. Tell them if they give you trouble, I'll come discuss it personally. Sheriff, that's going to be expensive. I didn't ask for a financial report. I gave you an order. Sam left at a run. Elias turned to the children. While we're waiting for food, I need information. Names, ages, where you've been sleeping, any adults who've been helping or hurting you. And I need to know about others, any more kids out there who need help. The oldest boy in the group, maybe 16 with shoulders starting to fill out, spoke up. There's more. Maybe 20 more. Some working in the mines, some hired out to ranches, some just disappeared and we don't know where they went. Disappeared how? Territorial authorities take them, say they're being placed in homes or apprenticeships, but we never see them again and nobody will say where they went. Elias's expression went very still, very cold. Names. I need all the names you can remember. For the next hour, the sheriff's office transformed into something Clara had never seen before. Elias took down information with methodical precision, names, ages, last known locations, details about the adults who'd employed or exploited them. The children talked, hesitantly at first, then in a flood as they realized someone was actually listening. Stories poured out. Abuse, neglect, labor that broke bodies and spirits. Adults who'd paid in scraps or not at all, who'd used fists and worse when children made mistakes. Clara listened and felt sick, because these stories were her story, Thomas's story, the story of every child who'd fallen through the cracks of a system that treated them as property instead of people. Sam returned with food, and the children ate with the same desperate hunger Clara and Thomas had shown. Real food, hot food, food that came without strings or shame. And while they ate, Elias kept writing, his pen scratching across page after page, building a case from their testimonies. Mrs. Patterson arrived, took one look at the crowded office, and immediately began organizing. Elias Crow, you can't house 15 children in a sheriff's office. I know. So what's your plan? I'm working on it. Well, work faster. But her voice was warm despite the sharp words. In the meantime, I'm taking the youngest ones to the boarding house. I've got empty rooms and these babies need proper beds and medical attention. We'll sort out payment later. Don't you Martha me. I've been running that boarding house for 20 years and I'll decide who stays there. She looked at the children with fierce maternal protection. Anyone under 8, you're coming with me. The rest of you, Sheriff Crow will find places. Won't you, Sheriff? It wasn't a question. Elias met her eyes and something passed between them, an understanding, a commitment, a declaration of war against the forces that had abandoned these children. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Patterson gathered the youngest children like a mother hen with her chicks and herded them toward the door. Danny coughed again, and she scooped him up without hesitation. This one needs a doctor first. Annie, you come too. Don't want you separated from your brother. Annie looked at Elias, uncertain. Go, he said gently. Mrs. Patterson will keep you safe. I'll check in later. They left in a small parade, the younger children holding hands, looking back at the office like they expected it to vanish like a dream. Clara watched them go and felt something twist in her chest. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope. The remaining children, 8 of them, including Clara and Thomas, stood in the now less crowded office and waited for what came next. What came next was a knock on the door, hard and official. Elias opened it to find 3 men in territorial uniforms, their badges marking them as federal marshals. Behind them stood Wade Hutchins, his face split in a triumphant smile. Sheriff Crow? The lead marshal was a thick man with a gray beard and eyes like chips of flint. I'm Marshal Hendricks. We need to talk about these children you've been collecting. The air in the sheriff's office changed the moment those words left Marshal Hendricks's mouth. Clara felt it like a physical thing, the way oxygen gets thin before a storm, the way animals go silent before an earthquake. Behind her, Thomas's breathing quickened. The other children pressed closer together, an instinctive huddle against predators. Elias didn't move from the doorway, didn't step back or invite them in, just stood there like a wall made of flesh and bone, an absolute conviction, one hand resting casual on his gun belt. Marshal, his voice was flat, empty of the warmth it had held moments before. What brings federal law enforcement to Silver Creek? Hendricks gestured past Elias to the children. Got reports of unauthorized child removal from legal employment, interference with territorial labor contracts, theft of property. His eyes settled on Clara, and she felt herself shrinking, becoming invisible again. That property, specifically. Property. Elias let the word hang in the air like a noose. You're calling children property. I'm calling indentured labor by its legal name. The girl there owes a debt to Mr. Hutchins. 3 months' room and board by his accounting. That's legally binding under Territorial Statute 703. Show me the contract. Don't need to show you anything, Sheriff. We've got Mr. Hutchins' sworn testimony and the backing of the territorial courts. That's all the authority we need. Behind Hendricks, Hutchins couldn't quite hide his smile. Clara saw it and felt rage bubble up through her fear, hot and bitter, and completely useless. Because what was a 10-year-old girl's anger against men with badges and guns and the law behind them? You want to take children from my protection based on sworn testimony from a man who's been exploiting child labor. Elias's voice stayed calm, but Clara heard the steel underneath. From a man who had a 10-year-old girl scrubbing blood off his floors at midnight? Who kept her in a storage closet and fed her scraps when he remembered? That's the testimony you're trusting? Mr. Hutchins is a respected businessman. Mr. Hutchins is a criminal. Elias cut him off. And if you try to return these children to his custody or anyone else who's been exploiting them, you're making yourself complicit in that crime. Hendricks' face flushed red. You watch your mouth, Crow. I've got the authority to remove you from office if you interfere with federal business. Then remove me. Elias's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. But while I'm still wearing this badge, these children are under my protection. You want them, you'll have to go through me. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd seen violence before, had the scars to prove it, but this was different. This was 2 forces colliding, and children were going to be crushed in the impact. One of the other marshals, younger with a thin mustache, put his hand on his gun. Sheriff, don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm not making it hard. I'm making it impossible. Elias didn't move, didn't flinch. These children are witnesses to exploitation, abuse, and illegal labor practices. I've documented their testimony, filed official reports, sent telegrams to the federal courthouse in Denver. You take them now, you're destroying evidence and silencing witnesses. That's obstruction of justice, last time I checked. Hendricks' eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Am I? Elias pulled a folded paper from his pocket and held it up. This is a copy of the telegram I sent 3 hours ago to Federal Judge Harrison Monroe. You know that name, Marshal? Man's got a particular interest in child welfare cases. Made his reputation prosecuting territorial officials who looked the other way on labor exploitation. He's expecting a full report from me by week's end, and he's expecting these children to be available for federal testimony. Clara saw the calculation happening behind Hendrix's eyes. The weighing of options, the measuring of risk. Whatever orders he'd been given, they hadn't accounted for federal oversight, hadn't accounted for a small-town sheriff who knew how to play the game. Those telegrams take time, Hendrix said, but his voice had lost its edge. Judge Monroe's office will need to verify, investigate. Could be weeks before any federal action. Could be. Elias tucked the paper away. But until then, these children stay under my protection. You got a problem with that, take it up with the judge. Hutchins pushed forward, his patience finally snapping. This is horse shit. That girl owes me money. 3 months of food and shelter ain't free. I got rights. You've got nothing. Elias finally looked directly at Hutchins, and his expression made the larger man step back. No contract, no legal documentation, no proof of employment beyond your word, which isn't worth the air it takes to speak it. What you do have is a pattern of child exploitation that I'm going to make sure follows you straight to federal court. You can't prove, can't I? Elias gestured to Clara and the other children. I've got witnesses, testimony, medical documentation of abuse and neglect. I've got the doctor's report on Clara's hands, on Thomas's ribs, on Danny Murphy's untreated pneumonia. I've got names and dates and a list of every child who's disappeared from Silver Creek in the past 2 years. You want to bet a federal judge won't find that interesting? The silence that followed was absolute. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Thomas breathing beside her, could hear the tick of the wall clock marking seconds that felt like hours. Hendrix broke first. This isn't over, Crow. No, Elias agreed. It's not. But it is over for today. You want these children, you bring me federal papers signed by a judge. Until then, get off my property. The marshals exchanged glances. Hutchins sputtered protests that nobody listened to. And then, slowly, they backed down. Not defeated. Clara could see that in their faces. But calculating new strategies, new approaches, new ways to win a war they'd expected to be a simple arrest. We'll be back, Hendrix promised. I'll be here. They left in a tight group, Hutchins shooting venomous looks over his shoulder. The door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin lid, and suddenly the office was just children and a lawman who'd just declared war on forces bigger than all of them combined. Clara found her voice first. They'll really come back. Yes. Elias turned from the door, and she saw the toll the confrontation had taken. The lines around his eyes deeper, the set of his shoulders carrying weight that hadn't been there an hour ago. They'll come back with lawyers and judges and every legal trick they can manufacture, and we'll deal with it. How? Thomas asked. You can't fight the whole territorial government. Maybe not. Elias moved to his desk and started gathering the papers he'd been writing. But I don't have to fight them alone. The telegram I mentioned, that was real. Judge Monroe is real, and he genuinely does care about child welfare cases. I served with his son during the territorial wars, saved the boy's life in a Cheyenne raid. Monroe owes me a favor, and I'm calling it in. The oldest boy in the group, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. His name was James, Claire remembered. 16 and built like he'd been doing hard labor since he could walk. And if the judge says no, if he sides with them, then we go higher, federal prosecutors, newspapers, anyone who'll listen. Elias met each child's eyes in turn. I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to get bad before it gets better. Powerful people are going to be angry. They're going to make threats. They might even make good on some of those threats. But I made you a promise, and I keep my promises. Nobody's taking you back to abuse. Nobody's selling you into mine work. Nobody's making you disappear. That's my word. Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, but opening. Like a seed splitting to let something new grow through. Trust was still dangerous. Hope was still fragile. But maybe, just maybe, they were worth the risk. What do we do now? She asked. Now? Elias looked around the crowded office, at the children who'd found their way to him, at the impossible task he'd set himself. Now we make this official. Sam. The young deputy appeared from where he'd been standing guard by the window. Sir? I need you to round up every citizen in Silver Creek who has space in their home and a conscience in their chest. Tell them Sheriff Crow is calling a town meeting at the church. 1 hour. Mandatory attendance for anyone who wants to keep doing business in my jurisdiction. Sam's eyes widen. Sheriff, that's within my legal authority as peace officer. This town's got a child welfare crisis, and the citizens are going to step up or answer for why they didn't. Go. Sam left at a run, and Elias turned back to the children. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to walk down Main Street together. All of us. We're going to that church, and we're going to make Silver Creek see you. Really see you. Not as problems or property or invisible labor, but as children who deserve protection. Then we're going to ask the people of this town a simple question. Are you going to help, or are you going to be part of the system that's been destroying these kids? And if they say no, James asked, then we'll know who our enemies are. Elias pulled on his coat, checked his gun, and squared his shoulders. But I don't think they will. Most people aren't evil, James. They're just scared or ignorant or too focused on their own problems to see the suffering right in front of them. Sometimes all it takes is forcing them to look. Clara understood what he was doing. Not just protecting them, but making them visible, making them real. Because invisible children were easy to exploit, easy to forget, easy to sacrifice to the machinery of profit and politics. But children with faces and names and stories, children standing in front of a whole town demanding to be seen, that was harder to ignore. They left the office in a group, Elias at the front, the children following in his wake like ducklings behind their mother. Clara walked beside Thomas, her bare feet, still too damaged for shoes, making small sounds on the wooden sidewalk. Behind them came James and the others, a ragged parade of survival and defiance. Silver Creek stopped and stared. Clara felt the weight of those stares like physical things. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. Women clutched their baskets. Men tipped back their hats and watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Everyone had an opinion written on their faces, but nobody spoke. Not until they reached the general store and a woman stepped out, blocking their path. She was maybe 40, wearing a practical dress and an expression that suggested she suffered no fools. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she owned half the businesses on Main Street through a combination of shrewd trading and an absolute refusal to be pushed around by men who thought women didn't belong in commerce. Sheriff Crow? Her voice carried across the street. What's all this about? Elias stopped, the children gathering behind him. Mrs. Chen, I'm calling a town meeting about child welfare. You'll be there? Depends. She looked at the children, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The too thin frames, the patched clothes, the wary expressions. These the orphans everyone's talking about? These are children who need help. Whether they're orphans or not shouldn't matter. Of course it matters. Orphans are the town's responsibility. She stepped closer, and Clara tensed, but the woman's expression wasn't hostile, just assessing. How many we talking about total? 15 confirmed, maybe 20 more that need locating. Margaret Chen's eyebrows rose. 30 children? Where have they been hiding? They haven't been hiding, Elias said quietly. We've been ignoring them. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. Around them, the gathering crowd shifted uncomfortably. Because he was right, and everyone knew it. Silver Creek had known there were orphaned children, had known some of them were working in dangerous conditions, had known and looked away because it was easier than dealing with the problem. Margaret Chen looked at the children for a long moment, then back at Elias. Meetings at the church, you said? 1 hour. I'll be there. She paused, then added, and I'll bring my ledgers. If we're taking on 30 children, we'll need to figure out costs. Food, shelter, clothing, medical care. Can't do this halfway. Something shifted in the crowd's energy. If Margaret Chen was committing resources, if she was treating this as a legitimate civic issue rather than one sheriff's crusade, then maybe it was real. Maybe it mattered. Other voices started calling out. The blacksmith pledging materials for beds, the seamstress offering fabric for clothes. The doctor, the same one who'd refused to treat Danny Murphy, suddenly remembering he had a civic duty to provide medical care regardless of payment. Clara watched it happen with a mixture of hope and cynicism. People were generous when witnesses were watching. The question was whether that generosity would survive past the public eye. They continued toward the church, the crowd growing as word spread. By the time they reached the white clapboard building with its modest steeple, half the town seemed to be following, some out of genuine concern, some out of curiosity, some because Margaret Chen had made it clear that showing up was the price of doing business in Silver Creek. The church was packed within minutes. Clara and the other children were ushered to the front pew, facing the crowd like defendants awaiting judgment. Elias stood before them, between the children and the town, and Clara realized that's exactly where he'd positioned himself. Shield and advocate both. The pastor, a thin man named Reverend Walsh, who'd been sleeping off a drunk when they arrived, stumbled in looking confused. "Sheriff, what's this about? I didn't authorize it. You're authorizing it now." Elias's tone left no room for argument. "We need the space. You got a problem with using your church to help children? We can discuss your priorities after." Walsh wisely shut his mouth. Elias waited until the murmuring settled, until every eye was on him, until the weight of the town's attention was focused and sharp. Then he spoke. "Most of you know me. I've been sheriff here for 15 years, seen this town grow from a mining camp to a real community, seen good people do good things, and seen others look away when doing good was inconvenient." He paused, letting that sink in. "Today, we're here because looking away isn't an option anymore." He gestured to the children. "These are Silver Creek's orphans. Some you've seen around town. Others have been invisible, working jobs that break their bodies, sleeping in places that break their spirits. All of them have been surviving on the margins while we went about our comfortable lives." A man in the back stood up. Clara recognized him as Henry Sutton, the livery owner who'd beaten Thomas. "Now hold on, Sheriff. Some of these kids were working legitimate jobs. I paid Thomas Reed fair wages." "You beat a 13-year-old boy for dropping a saddle," Elias cut him off. "That's not legitimate employment. That's abuse. Boy needed discipline. Boy needed protection. From you." Elias's voice hardened. "And before anyone else starts defending the indefensible, let me be clear. I have documented testimony from these children about their treatment, medical evidence of abuse, names and dates of labor law violations. If anyone in this room wants to stand up and claim they've been treating these children fairly, I will personally ensure your testimony is included in the federal investigation I've initiated." That shut down the protests fast. Elias continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "The territorial system is broken. Officials in the capital have been profiting off child labor for years, selling kids to mines, ranches, anyone willing to pay. When children run away, they're hunted down and returned to worse conditions. When they die, and they do die, it's written off as the cost of doing business." He let that hang in the air, let the ugliness of it settle into their consciences. "I'm done pretending that's acceptable. I'm done being a sheriff who keeps the peace while children are being destroyed. So here's what's going to happen." He pulled out the papers he'd been working on all morning. "I've filed for emergency custody of 15 children currently under my protection. I've requested federal oversight of Silver Creek's child welfare practices, and I've sent word to Judge Monroe that this town needs intervention." He looked around the room. "But federal help takes time. These children need help now. Today. So I'm asking you, all of you, to step up." Margaret Chen stood from her pew. "What exactly are you proposing, Sheriff?" "A system. Official, legal, transparent. We house these children properly. Not in saloons or haylofts, but in real homes with real families. We feed them, clothe them, get them medical care. We find work for the older ones who want it, but regulated work with fair pay and protection. And we do it publicly, with documentation, so nobody can make these kids disappear again." "That's going to cost money," someone called out. "Town budget can't handle—" "Then we raise the money," Margaret Chen interrupted. "Special levy, donation fund, whatever it takes. I'll match the first $100 personally." A murmur ran through the crowd. If Margaret Chen was putting up money, if she was treating this as a legitimate civic project, then it had weight. It had credibility. The doctor stood, looking uncomfortable. "I can provide medical care. No charge for the children." The seamstress added her voice. "I'll make clothes. Cost of materials only." One by one, people stood. The baker promising bread, the carpenter offering to build beds, the hotel owner agreeing to house older children in exchange for light work. Not everyone contributed. Clara could see the holdouts, the ones whose faces stayed closed and hostile, but enough voices rose that a possibility emerged, a path forward that didn't depend on one lawman fighting alone. Then Wade Hutchins stood up from where he'd been sitting in the back, his face purple with rage. "This is insanity! You can't just steal a man's property and call it charity. I had a contract with that girl. You had nothing," Elias said flatly. "No legal documentation, no witnessed agreement, nothing but exploitation backed by a corrupt system. I provided for her, fed her, gave her shelter. You worked a 10-year-old child past midnight scrubbing blood for scraps of food and a dirt floor to sleep on." Elias descended from the front of the church, walking toward Hutchins with deliberate steps. "You want to keep claiming that's charity, Wade? You want to stand here in front of the whole town and defend that?" Hutchins' mouth worked, but no words came out. Around him, people were shifting away, creating distance, because now he was visible too. Now his actions were being examined in the light instead of hidden in the shadows. "I want compensation," Hutchins finally managed. "For the 3 months, file a complaint with the federal court," Elias suggested. "See how that works out for you." The laughter that rippled through the church was small but significant. Hutchins heard it, understood he'd lost this battle, and stormed out with what remained of his dignity in tatters. Elias returned to the front of the church. "Anyone else want to defend exploiting children? Now's your chance." Silence. Heavy and complete. "Good." Elias looked at the children, then back at the crowd. "We're going to do this right. Legal, documented, above board. And if the territorial authorities have a problem with it, they can take it up with federal oversight. This town is going to show that protecting children isn't radical or unrealistic. It's basic human decency." Reverend Walsh, finding his voice again, stepped forward. "Sheriff, the church should be involved in this. It's our Christian duty." "Then start acting like it," Elias said bluntly. "Open your doors. Organize the volunteers. Make yourself useful instead of decorative." Walsh flushed, but nodded. The meeting continued for another hour, practical details being hammered out. Who would house which children? How costs would be divided? What work was appropriate for different ages? Margaret Chen took charge of the logistics with the efficiency of someone who'd built an empire from nothing, and gradually a structure emerged from the chaos. Clara watched it all happen with a feeling like vertigo. 3 days ago, she'd been invisible. Property, disposal. Now she was sitting in a church while adults argued about how best to protect her. It was surreal, impossible, and yet it was happening. When the meeting finally broke up, when people started filing out with assignments and commitments, Elias gathered the children together. "You're going to go home with different families tonight, temporary placements until we get something more permanent established. I need you to trust me on this." "Will we see each other?" Clara asked, and heard the fear in her own voice. Because these children were the first people in months who'd understood, who'd shared her experience, who'd made her feel less alone. "Every day," Elias promised. "You'll go to school together. Work together if you want. This isn't about separating you, it's about giving you real homes instead of whatever scraps you've been surviving on." Thomas spoke up. "What if the families don't want us? What if we're too much trouble?" Then they weren't the right families. Elias crouched down so he was eye level with all of them. "Listen to me, all of you. This is going to be hard. Some people in this town don't want to help. Others are helping out of guilt or fear, and that kind of help doesn't last. You're going to face prejudice and resentment and people who think you should be grateful for whatever they deign to give you. But you're also going to find good people, real people, the kind who help because it's right, not because someone's watching. Hold on to those people, build families with them. And know that no matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. You need help. You come find me, day or night. That's my promise to you." Clara felt tears burning in her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. Crying was weakness, and weakness meant vulnerability and vulnerability. Thomas grabbed her hand, squeezed it, and suddenly she wasn't alone in the breaking. Around them, families started approaching. A farming couple for James, the school teacher for 2 of the younger girls. Margaret Chen herself stepping forward to take Annie and Danny Murphy, because if she was going to organize this effort, she might as well lead by example. And for Clara, a woman she'd never seen before, small and quiet, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they knew hard work. Her name was Sarah Reeves, and she was a widow who ran a small ranch outside town. "I lost my daughter 5 years ago," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside Clara. "Influenza. She was 9. I'm not trying to replace her, and I'm not expecting you to replace what you've lost. But I have space, and I have time, and I'd like to help. Would that be all right?" Clara looked at Elias, who nodded encouragement, looked at Thomas, who was being claimed by the blacksmith and his wife, looked at this woman who was offering something Clara had forgotten existed. A home. Not shelter. Not survival. A home. "Yes," Clara whispered. "That would be all right." Sarah Reeves's ranch sat 3 miles outside Silver Creek, connected to town by a dirt road that cut through sage and scrub grass like a scar across brown skin. Clara rode in the wagon beside her new guardian, watching the town shrink behind them until it was just a smudge of buildings against the vast, empty sky. The desert stretched in all directions, beautiful and terrible in its indifference, and Clara felt herself getting smaller with each turn of the wheels. "You're quiet," Sarah observed. Her voice was gentle, not pushing, just acknowledging. Clara didn't know how to explain that quiet was survival, that speaking meant being noticed, and being noticed meant being vulnerable, and she'd spent 3 months learning to be invisible. Old habits didn't die just because someone offered you a bedroom instead of a storage closet. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "That's all right. We've got time to figure each other out." Sarah guided the horses with confident hands, her eyes on the road. "I'm not good at speeches or making promises I can't keep. What I can tell you is this. My house has rules, but they're fair rules. You help with chores appropriate for your age. You go to school when it starts up again next month. You don't lie to me, and I won't lie to you. And if something's wrong, if you're scared or hurt or just need to talk, you tell me. Deal?" It sounded too simple, too straightforward. In Claire's experience, adults said one thing and meant another, used words like weapons to trap you into compliance. But Sarah's face was open, honest, showing the same kind of worn-down integrity that Elias carried in his weathered features. "Deal," Clara whispered. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a modest house built from local stone, a barn that had seen better years, corrals holding a handful of horses. Not wealthy, but maintained, cared for. The kind of place that spoke of someone who worked hard and didn't complain about it. Sarah helped Clara down from the wagon, and for the first time, Clara noticed her own bare feet against the packed earth, felt the sting of cuts that hadn't healed, the throb of bruises layered on bruises. She'd gotten so used to pain that she'd stopped noticing it. But now, standing in this quiet place with this quiet woman, the accumulated damage of 3 months made itself known. "First things first," Sarah said, seeing Clara's wince. "Let's get you cleaned up and those feet looked at properly. Then food, then we'll worry about everything else." The house was small but tidy. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee. Sarah led Clara to a bedroom that had been closed up, the furniture covered with sheets, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light filtering through curtains. "This was Emma's room," Sarah said quietly, pulling the sheets off to reveal a narrow bed, a dresser, a rocking chair by the window. "My daughter. I haven't changed anything since she passed, couldn't bear to, but keeping it like a shrine isn't helping anyone." She looked at Clara with eyes that had known loss and survived it. She'd want someone to use it, someone who needed it. "So it's yours now, if you want it." Clara stepped into the room and felt something crack in her chest. It was just a room, just furniture and walls and a window. But it represented something she'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of permanence, of belonging, of a place that was hers not because she'd earned it through blood and suffering, but because someone thought she deserved it. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "I want it." Sarah nodded once, brisk and efficient, but Clara caught the shine in her eyes before she turned away. "Good. Now sit on that bed and let me see those feet." What followed was an hour of gentle care that hurt worse than any beating Clara had endured. Sarah cleaned each cut with warm water and soap, her movements careful and methodical, explaining what she was doing before she did it. She applied salve that stung like fire, but smelled like herbs. She wrapped Clara's feet in clean bandages and found a pair of soft socks that had belonged to Emma. "You'll need real shoes," Sarah said, examining Clara's 2 small feet with a critical eye. "We'll go into town tomorrow, get you fitted properly. For tonight, these socks should help." Clara looked down at her bandaged feet and felt something unfamiliar working its way up her throat. Gratitude. The dangerous kind that came with strings and expectations, and the inevitable moment when the person helping you decided you weren't worth the trouble. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "You don't know me. I could be trouble. I could steal from you, or run away, or—" "You could," Sarah agreed, "but you won't." "How do you know?" "Because you're not looking at those bandages like someone planning to run. You're looking at them like someone who can't believe anyone bothered to care." Sarah sat back on her heels, meeting Clara's eyes. "I know that look, child. Wore it myself once. Before Emma, before this ranch, I was on my own, 15 years old with nothing but the clothes on my back and a determination to survive. People helped me when they didn't have to, changed my life. So now I help when I can. It's not charity, it's paying forward what I was given." The words settled into Clara like seeds in soil, finding purchase in places that had been barren too long. She wanted to believe them, wanted to trust that help could exist without hooks. But belief was dangerous, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Still, she nodded. And Sarah, reading the complexity in that simple gesture, didn't push for more. They ate dinner as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that hurt to look at. Sarah made stew with vegetables from her garden and bread that was crusty and warm. Clara ate slowly, her stomach still adjusting to regular food, and listened to Sarah talk about the ranch, the horses, the rhythm of life out here in the empty spaces. "Tomorrow you'll meet the others," Sarah said, sopping up stew with her bread. "I've got 2 ranch hands who help with the heavy work. Good men, both of them. Keep to themselves mostly, but they'll look out for you. And on Sundays we usually ride into town for church and supplies. You'll see your friends then." Friends. The word sat strange in Clara's mouth. She'd never had friends before. The orphanage hadn't allowed friendships, too risky, too likely to lead to coordinated resistance. And the 3 months since had been about survival, not connection. But Thomas and Annie and the others felt like something close to friendship, shared understanding born from shared suffering. "Can I ask you something?" Clara ventured. "Always." "In the church, when everyone was arguing about taking us in, why did you volunteer? There were other children, younger ones, easier ones. Why me?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "Because when Sheriff Crow was describing the conditions you'd been living in, I saw myself. Not the details, but the shape of it. The being used, the being invisible, the surviving day by day without hope for anything better." She looked up, and her eyes were fierce. "And I remember what it felt like when someone saw me anyway. When someone decided I was worth saving even though I couldn't see it myself. So I'm doing for you what was done for me. Seeing you. Deciding you're worth it, and trusting that eventually you'll believe it too." Clara felt tears burning but blinked them back. "What if I'm not? Worth it, I mean." "Then I'll be wrong, but I don't think I am." Sarah stood and started clearing dishes. "You survived 3 months of hell and came out the other side still fighting. That takes strength, Clara. The kind of strength that doesn't quit. That's worth something. Worth a lot, actually." They cleaned the dishes together in comfortable silence, Clara learning the rhythm of Sarah's kitchen, the placement of things, the routines that made a house a home. When the last dish was dried and put away, Sarah showed her how to bank the fire in the stove, how to check the doors were locked, how to do all the small domestic tasks that created safety. "Bedtime's around 9, Sarah said, leading Clara back to Emma's room, to her room now. "But tonight you can stay up as long as you need. Get comfortable. Look through the books on the shelf if you want. Emma loved to read. Everything in this room is yours to use." She left Clara alone with an oil lamp and the overwhelming reality of having space. Private space. A door that closed. A window with a view of stars instead of saloon ceilings. A bed with real sheets and a quilt that smelled like lavender. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at the evidence of another girl's life. Books lined one shelf, Titles like Little Women and Treasure Island and A Child's Garden of Verses. A carved wooden horse sat on the dresser next to a hairbrush with blonde hairs still caught in the bristles. A sampler hung on the wall with uneven stitching that spelled out, "Home is where the heart is." This had been a loved child's room, a wanted child. A child whose mother had kept her room untouched for 5 years because the loss was too great to process. And now Clara was supposed to just live here? Use these things? Pretend she deserved this space that had been carved out of someone else's grief? The guilt hit like a physical blow. She didn't belong here, didn't deserve this kindness. She was disposal, property, a thing to be used and discarded. Sarah would realize her mistake eventually. They always did. Better to not get comfortable. Better to remember this was temporary. Better to stay ready to run. Clara lay down on the bed fully clothed, on top of the quilt instead of under it, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, coyotes called to each other in the darkness. The wind picked up, rattling the window in its frame, and somewhere in the house, Sarah moved around preparing for sleep, her footsteps familiar and steady. Clara didn't expect to sleep. But exhaustion was a patient predator, and eventually it pulled her under despite her resistance. She woke to screaming, her own screaming, she realized, as Sarah burst into the room with a lamp held high. Clara was tangled in sheets she didn't remember getting under, her body drenched in sweat, her throat raw. "You're all right," Sarah said, setting the lamp down and sitting on the edge of the bed. "Just a dream. You're safe." But Clara couldn't stop shaking. The nightmare was already fading, but the fear remained, thick and choking and absolutely real. The orphanage, the men in suits, the phrase disposal of defective inventory echoing in her head like a death sentence. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Hush." Sarah's hand was gentle on Clara's shoulder, not restraining, just grounding. "Nothing to apologize for. Bad dreams happen, especially after what you've been through. I'll try not to. Clara, listen to me." Sarah waited until Clara met her eyes. "I'm not going to punish you for having nightmares. I'm not going to send you away because you're scared. That's not how this works. You're allowed to be frightened. You're allowed to struggle. You're allowed to be a child who's been through trauma and needs time to heal. Understand?" Clara wanted to believe her. Wanted it so badly it hurt. But belief required trust, and trust required vulnerability. And vulnerability was how you got destroyed. Still, she nodded. Because what else could she do? Sarah stayed with her until her breathing settled, until the shaking stopped, until Clara could lie back down without feeling like the walls were closing in. When she finally left, she kept the lamp burning low, and the door cracked open, and Clara heard her settle into the rocking chair in the main room, keeping watch, keeping her safe. The next morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon, sunlight streaming through the window like a promise. Clara woke slowly, disoriented by softness and safety, and for a moment couldn't remember where she was. Then it came back. The ranch, Sarah, the bedroom that was hers now. She got up carefully, her bandaged feet protesting, and found clothes laid out on the dresser. Emma's clothes, altered to fit. A simple dress in faded blue, undergarments, the soft socks from last night. Clara dressed slowly, feeling strange in clothes that fit properly, instead of hanging loose or pulling tight. Sarah was in the kitchen when Clara emerged, and her face showed no signs of the interrupted sleep, no annoyance at having to comfort a troubled child in the night. "Morning," she said, sliding eggs onto a plate. "How are those feet feeling?" "Better?" It was even true. The bandages and salve had helped, the pain reduced from screaming to tolerable. "Good. Eat up, then we'll head into town. Need to get you shoes and a few other things. Plus, I want to check in with Sheriff Crow, see how the other placements are going." They rode into Silver Creek mid-morning, the wagon rattling over the rutted road. The town looked different in daylight, less threatening, just a collection of buildings trying to be more important than geography suggested. But Clara still felt her body tense as they approached, old instincts kicking in. The sheriff's office was their first stop. Elias was at his desk when they walked in, surrounded by paperwork that seemed to have multiplied overnight. He looked up and something eased in his expression when he saw Clara. "Mrs. Reeves." "Clara. Good timing. I was about to make rounds, check on all the placements." How's it going? Sarah asked. Mixed. Elias stood and stretched, his back cracking. Most families are doing well. The Murphys are settling in with Margaret Chen. She's already got Annie helping in her store and Danny's seeing the doctor daily. Thomas is thriving with the blacksmith, but a few placements aren't working out. The Hendersons returned Mary this morning, said she was too difficult. Too difficult how? Sarah's voice sharpened. She didn't smile enough, wasn't grateful enough, had the audacity to cry at night. Elias's tone was flat, but anger simmered underneath. Some people want to feel like saviors, not actually do the work of helping traumatized children. What happened to Mary? She's with Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house for now. I'm looking for a better placement. He glanced at Clara. How was your first night? Clara looked at Sarah, unsure how to answer. The nightmare had been bad, but Sarah hadn't punished her for it, had stayed with her, had made it clear that struggling was allowed. She had a rough night, Sarah said when Clara didn't answer. Nightmares. But we worked through it. That going to be a problem? Elias asked, and Clara heard the edge in his voice. The unspoken threat that if Sarah tried to return Clara like defective merchandise, she'd answer to him. Not even a little, Sarah said firmly. Just wanted you to know in case other placements are dealing with similar issues. These children are going to need time and patience. Anyone who expected them to just slot into normal family life immediately was fooling themselves. Elias nodded slowly. I'll make that clear. Maybe save us some heartbreak down the road. He looked at Clara directly. You doing all right? Need anything? The question caught her off guard. Need anything. As if her needs mattered, as if she was allowed to have needs beyond basic survival. I'm okay, she managed. That's not what I asked. Clara swallowed hard. Shoes. We're getting shoes today. Good. Let Sarah know if you need anything else. Clothes, school supplies, anything. There's a fund set up now. Donations from the town meeting. It's for all of you kids. A fund. Money specifically for them. It felt surreal, impossible, like a dream that would evaporate if she examined it too closely. They left the office and headed to the general store, where Margaret Chen was reorganizing shelves while Annie Murphy swept the floor. The girl looked up when they entered, and her face transformed when she saw Clara. Clara, you're here! Annie dropped the broom and rushed over. How's the ranch? Is it nice? Are you okay? The questions tumbled out in a rush, and Clara found herself overwhelmed by the genuine concern in Annie's voice. They'd only known each other a day, but that shared experience in the sheriff's office had created a bond. It's good, Clara said carefully. How's your brother? Better. Mrs. Chen had the doctor come twice already. He's got medicine now, and he's breathing easier. He even smiled this morning. Annie's eyes shone with tears. I was so scared, Clara. So scared he was going to die, but maybe we're going to be okay. Margaret Chen approached, her sharp gaze taking in Clara's bandaged feet and borrowed clothes. Need shoes, I'm guessing? Yes, ma'am. Sit. She pointed to a chair and disappeared into the back room, returning with several boxes. Let's see what fits. The process of being fitted for shoes was strange and uncomfortable. Margaret Chen's hands were efficient but not unkind, measuring Clara's feet, testing different sizes, finally settling on a pair of sturdy brown leather boots that would hold up to ranch work. These'll need breaking in, Margaret warned. Wear them an hour at a time at first. Let your feet adjust. Sarah, make sure she keeps those bandages changed until the cuts heal completely. Will do. Margaret moved to the counter and began tallying numbers. Boots are $4. We've also got... Put it on the children's fund, Sarah interrupted. You sure? You can afford... I can afford to feed and house one child. The fund's for everything else. That was the agreement at the meeting. Sarah's voice was firm. Don't make me special just because I've got land. We're all in this together. Margaret nodded slowly, respect evident in her expression. Together, right. She adjusted her ledger. Any other children come through today? Sheriff's still looking for placements. Said the Hendersons returned Mary. Margaret's face darkened. I heard. Told Elias I'd take her if he gets desperate, but I've already got the Murphys and I'm running a business. Can't spread myself too thin. What about the church? Clara asked quietly. Reverend Walsh said it was their duty. Reverend Walsh says a lot of things, Margaret said dryly. Actually, following through is another matter. He's organized a donation collection, which is helpful, but he hasn't offered to house any children himself. The hypocrisy stung. Clara had learned not to expect much from adults who claimed to care, but it still hurt when they proved her cynicism correct. They finished shopping, acquiring undergarments, a second dress, a coat for winter, basic necessities, and headed back toward the wagon. As they passed the Desert Rose Saloon, Clara felt her body lock up. The building looked smaller in daylight, less threatening, but the memories were still vivid. The blood she'd scrubbed, the exhaustion, the fear. Wade Hutchins stood outside, talking to a man in an expensive suit. When he saw Clara, his expression curdled into something ugly. "That's her," he said loudly, pointing. "That's the girl who robbed me. 3 months of debt she owes, and the sheriff just stole her away." The man in the suit looked at Clara with cold assessment. "You're certain about the debt amount?" "Certain as sin. Got witnesses who'll testify she was working for room and board. That's legally binding employment." Sarah stepped between Clara and the men, her body language shifting from gentle to protective in an instant. "You had a 10-year-old child doing hard labor past midnight for scraps of food and a dirt floor. That's not employment, that's exploitation." "That's your opinion," Hutchins sneered. "Law might see it different." "Then take it to court," Sarah shot back. "File your complaint with Judge Monroe. See how that works out for you." The man in the suit spoke up, his voice smooth and educated. "I'm attorney William Bradford, representing Mr. Hutchins and several other business owners in this matter. The sheriff's actions were legally questionable at best. We intend to challenge his custody claims and seek compensation for lost labor." "Lost labor?" Sarah's voice could have cut glass. "You mean lost victims, children you were exploiting?" "Careful, Mrs. Reeves. Slander is actionable." "Truth isn't slander, Mr. Bradford." They stared at each other, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Clara felt frozen, her newly booted feet rooted to the ground. This was it. The moment when everything collapsed, when the adults with power and money demonstrated that kindness was no match for law and leverage. Then Elias Crow's voice cut through the standoff like a blade. "Bradford, didn't know you were in town." The attorney turned, his expression shifting to something calculating. "Sheriff, I was just discussing the situation with Mrs. Reeves, explaining the legal complications of your crusade." "No complications," Elias said, moving to stand beside Sarah. "Just federal law being enforced properly for once. You got a problem with that? File your motion with Judge Monroe. Until then, these children are under my legal protection." "Your protection won't last," Bradford said quietly. "The territorial government has resources you can't match. Connections. Influence. You've made powerful enemies, Sheriff Crow." "Good." Elias's smile was cold. "Powerful enemies mean I'm doing something right." Bradford studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Hutchins followed, shooting venomous looks over his shoulder. Clara realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out in a rush. "Are they going to take us back?" "They're going to try," Elias said honestly. "But trying and succeeding are different things. Judge Monroe received my telegram. His response came this morning. He's sending federal investigators to Silver Creek. Should be here within the week." "And if they rule against you?" "Then we appeal. And appeal again. And keep appealing until we find someone who gives a damn about children being exploited." He looked down at Clara, and his expression gentled. "I'm not giving up on you, on any of you. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we see this through. That's my promise." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted it with an intensity that hurt, but she'd learned that promises were like desert rain, brief, beautiful, and ultimately evaporating into nothing. Still, she nodded, because what else could she do? They returned to the ranch as afternoon stretched toward evening, Sarah quiet and thoughtful, Clara exhausted from the emotional toll of the day. The confrontation with Hutchins and Bradford had dredged up all her worst fears, all the certainty that safety was temporary and happiness was a lie told to make suffering more bearable. That night, after dinner, Sarah found Clara sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, settling into the rocking chair beside her. Clara was quiet for a long time. Then, they're going to win, aren't they? Hutchins and that lawyer, they have money and law and power. We just have, what, hope? That's not enough. Maybe not, Sarah agreed, but it's something, and sometimes something is all you need to start. She rocked slowly, the chair creaking in rhythm. You know what I think? I think you've spent so long expecting the worst that you can't see the good even when it's right in front of you. Can't see that a whole town showed up to help, that families opened their homes, that a sheriff risked his career and a judge committed federal resources. That's not nothing, Clara. That's people choosing to do right when they could have chosen easy. But what if it's not enough? Then we try harder. Sarah reached over and took Clara's hand. Listen to me, child. I'm not naive. I know the world is cruel and power usually wins. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, good people stand up and fight back. And when they do, when they really commit to it, they can move mountains. Maybe we lose this fight. Maybe Bradford and his territorial bosses find some legal loophole and everything falls apart. But maybe we win. And won't we feel foolish if we gave up before even trying? Clara looked at their joined hands, at the way Sarah held on without crushing, firm without controlling. It was such a small thing, such an insignificant gesture. But it represented something larger, something that might be called family if Clara dared to name it. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too. Sarah squeezed her hand. But we're scared together, and that makes all the difference. They sat there as darkness fell, watching stars emerge like promises written in light, and Clara felt something fragile taking root in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of both. The understanding that even if everything fell apart tomorrow, tonight she'd had this moment. Tonight she'd been seen, valued, protected. Tonight she'd been allowed to just be a child. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth fighting for. The federal investigators arrived on a Tuesday morning when the desert air was sharp with the promise of winter. Clara was helping Sarah mend fence line when they saw the dust cloud on the horizon, resolving gradually into 3 riders approaching at a steady pace. Something in Sarah's posture changed, her body going still the way prey animals do when they sense predators. Go to the house, she said quietly. Find the rifle above the mantel. Don't load it. Just have it ready. Sarah. Now, Clara. The urgency in her voice sent Clara running despite the protest of her still healing feet. She reached the house, climbed on a chair to retrieve the heavy Winchester, and positioned herself by the window where she could see the approaching riders while staying hidden behind the curtain. But as the riders drew closer, Clara recognized the lead figure, Elias Crow, sitting tall in the saddle, his badge catching the morning sun. Relief flooded through her so powerfully her knees went weak. She burst out of the house as the riders reached the fence line. It's the sheriff! Sarah's shoulders dropped, tension releasing. So it is. Guess those aren't the investigators we were worried about. Elias dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent half his life on horseback. The 2 people with him climbed down more carefully. A woman in her 50s wearing a traveling suit that spoke of Eastern money, and a man about Elias's age with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Mrs. Reeves, Clara, Elias said. This is Judge Harrison Monroe and his clerk, Miss Elizabeth Thornton. They've come from Denver to investigate the situation. Judge Monroe had a weathered face that suggested he'd spent time on the frontier before ascending to the bench, and eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Reeves, the sheriff speaks highly of you, says you took in one of the children without hesitation. Wasn't a matter of hesitation, Sarah said, shaking his offered hand. Just doing what needed doing. If only more people shared that philosophy. Monroe turned his attention to Clara and his expression gentled. And you must be Clara Wynne. I've read Sheriff Crow's report about your situation, about all the children's situations. I'd like to hear your version, if you're willing to tell it. Clara looked at Elias, who nodded encouragement. Yes, sir. Good. Is there somewhere we can talk? This is going to take a while. They gathered in Sarah's kitchen, the table too small for comfort but functional. Miss Thornton produced a leather notebook and fountain pen, her movements precise and practiced. Judge Monroe settled into his chair with the patience of someone who'd conducted 1,000 interviews and would conduct 1,000 more. "Start from the beginning," he said gently. "The orphanage. What you remember about why you ran." And Clara told it, all of it. The stone walls and iron bars, the children sorted by size and strength like livestock at auction, the conversation she'd overheard about disposal of defective inventory, her 3-day walk through the desert, Wade Hutchins finding her half dead and offering what had seemed like salvation. The reality of that salvation, midnight work scrubbing blood for scraps, sleeping on dirt floors, the constant fear that one mistake would send her back to worse. She told it without crying, her voice flat and factual, because emotion was weakness and she'd learned to survive without it. But halfway through, Sarah's hand found hers under the table and held on, and Clara realized she didn't have to be strong alone anymore. Miss Thornton's pen scratched steadily across paper, recording every word. Judge Monroe's expression remained neutral, but Clara saw his jaw tighten when she described the orphanage's disposal policy, saw his hands clench when she talked about Hutchins' exploitation. When she finished, silence settled over the kitchen like snow. "How many other children?" Monroe finally asked. "In the orphanage? How many were there when you left?" "Maybe 40, but they came and went. The strong ones got leased out. The weak ones—" Clara trailed off. "I don't know what happened to the weak ones. They just disappeared." "And the territorial authorities knew about this?" "Yes, sir. They ran it. Men in suits came once a month to inspect. They're the ones who decided who went where." Monroe looked at Elias. "You mentioned in your report that children were being leased to mines and ranches. Do you have documentation?" "Names, dates, and testimonies from 15 children. 3 more came forward yesterday. Been hiding in the hills, afraid to come into town. They've got stories about the copper mines in Utah that'll turn your stomach." Elias pulled a thick folder from his saddlebag. "It's all here. Every detail we could gather." Monroe took the folder and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. Miss Thornton leaned over to read along, and Clara saw her face go pale. "This is systematic," Monroe said quietly. "This isn't isolated abuse or a few bad actors. This is an organized system of child exploitation running through multiple territories with government sanction." "Yes, sir," Elias confirmed. "And it goes higher than local officials. The contracts are approved in the territorial capital. Money changes hands. Everyone gets their cut except the children being destroyed in the process." "Have you identified specific officials?" 7 so far. Judges, territorial administrators, business owners. Bradford, the attorney who showed up threatening legal action, he's been facilitating the contracts, getting paid for each child placed. Monroe closed the folder and sat back, and for the first time, Clara saw real anger break through his judicial composure. "This ends. All of it. Miss Thornton, I want warrants prepared for every official named in these reports. Federal charges, child endangerment, labor exploitation, fraud, conspiracy. Anyone who participated in this system answers to federal court." "Sir, the political fallout, I don't care about political fallout. These are children." His voice was steel wrapped in ice. "American children being sold like livestock with government approval. If that doesn't warrant federal intervention, nothing does." He stood and began pacing Sarah's small kitchen, his movement sharp with contained fury. "Sheriff Crow, I need you to gather all the children currently under your protection. Tomorrow. Town meeting, similar to what you did before, but this time it's official federal testimony. Every child who's willing to speak needs to tell their story on record. Can you arrange that?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Mrs. Reeves, I'll need Clara's testimony as well. Detailed testimony about the orphanage, about Hutchins, about everything. Will she be able to handle that?" Sarah looked at Clara, the question clear in her eyes. Clara swallowed hard and nodded. "I can do it." "You don't have to," Sarah said softly. "You've already told your story once. That should be enough." "But it's not." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "If my story helps stop this from happening to other children, then I have to tell it, as many times as it takes." Judge Monroe's expression softened. "You're a brave girl, Clara." "Braver than many adults I've known." "I'm not brave," Clara said. "I'm just tired of being scared." The meeting was set for the next afternoon at the church, the same place where Silver Creek had decided to help its orphans. But this time, the stakes were higher. This time, it wasn't about local charity, it was about federal prosecution, about making power answer for its crimes. Word spread through town like wildfire. By the time Clara and Sarah arrived, the church was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the steps. But the energy was different from the first meeting, heavier, more tense, because everyone understood that what happened here would have consequences that reached far beyond Silver Creek. Judge Monroe sat at a table facing the congregation, Miss Thornton beside him with her notebook ready. Elias stood to one side, and Clara realized he'd positioned himself between the children and the crowd. Still protecting, still standing guard. All 15 children were there. Clara, Thomas, Annie, and Danny, Mary, who'd been returned by the Hendersons, and the others who'd found their way to safety. They sat in the front pews, a ragged collection of survivors who'd been invisible too long. And in the back, Wade Hutchins and Attorney Bradford sat with faces carved from stone, flanked by 3 men Clara didn't recognize. Territorial officials, she guessed from their expensive suits and the way they carried themselves with the arrogance of unchallenged power. Monroe called the meeting to order, his voice carrying authority that made the crowd settle immediately. We're here today to conduct official federal testimony regarding allegations of systematic child labor exploitation in Silver Creek and the surrounding territories. What you're about to hear will be difficult. Some of you will want to deny it, dismiss it, or defend the people being accused. I'm telling you now, don't. Listen, learn, and understand that this is happening whether you believe it or not. He called Clara first. She walked to the front of the church on legs that threatened to give out, aware of every eye on her. Sarah gave her hand a final squeeze before letting go, and Clara felt the loss of that anchor like a physical thing. "State your name for the record," Miss Thornton said. "Clara Wynne." Her voice came out thin, barely audible. "Louder, please. Everyone needs to hear." Clara took a breath and tried again. "Clara Wynne. I'm 10 years old, almost 11. Monroe's questions were gentle but thorough, walking her through the story again with added detail. The conditions at the orphanage, the labor leasing system, the disposal policy for children deemed unproductive, her escape and arrival in Silver Creek, Hutchins' exploitation disguised as charity. With each answer, Clara felt the weight of the crowd's attention shift, disbelief giving way to horror, denial crumbling under the accumulation of specific terrible details. These weren't vague allegations anymore. They were facts, dates, names, reality that couldn't be dismissed. Hutchins tried. "That girl's lying. She's been coached to say all this." The sheriff put these ideas in her head. "Mr. Hutchins," Monroe's voice cut through the protest like a blade. "You'll have your opportunity to respond. Right now, this child is testifying under oath. You interrupt again, I'll have you removed and charged with contempt." Hutchins subsided, but the rage in his face promised retribution. Clara finished her testimony and returned to her seat, her body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Sarah's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm, and Clara let herself lean into that strength. Thomas went next. Then Annie. Then Mary, who cried through most of her testimony but pushed through anyway. One by one, the children told their stories, and the pattern emerged clear and undeniable. This wasn't individual tragedy. This was system, policy, crime masquerading as legitimate business. When the last child finished, Monroe turned his attention to the territorial officials in the back. "Gentlemen, you're here representing the territorial government, I assume." The eldest of the 3 stood, a silver-haired man with the bearing of old money and older privilege. "I'm Robert Cartwright, territorial administrator for this region. We've been listening to these allegations with great concern." Concern. Monroe's tone suggested what he thought of that word. "Mr. Cartwright, are you aware that the orphanage described in these testimonies operates under territorial charter?" "I am." "Are you aware that children have been leased from that facility to mines, ranches, and private businesses under contracts approved by your office?" Cartwright's face remained impassive. "The territorial government has an apprenticeship program designed to provide practical skills and employment for orphan children. It's perfectly legal. Legal under territorial statute, illegal under federal law prohibiting child labor exploitation." Monroe cut him off. Were you aware of the conditions these children were working under? The abuse? The lack of compensation? The disposal of children deemed unprofitable? Those are serious allegations requiring investigation. We would never condone. You didn't just condone it, Mr. Cartwright. You facilitated it. You signed the contracts. You collected the fees. You built a system that profits off the destruction of children. Monroe stood, and suddenly he seemed to fill the church. I have documentation, signed contracts with your name on them, financial records showing payments made to your office for each child leased, evidence of systematic fraud, corruption, and child endangerment spanning at least 5 years. So don't stand there and pretend ignorance. Own what you've done. The church had gone absolutely silent. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Danny Murphy's wheezing breath, could hear the tick of someone's pocket watch marking seconds that felt like hours. Cartwright's composure finally cracked. Those contracts were legal under territorial law. We had authority. What? You had nothing. Monroe's voice was cold steel. Federal law supersedes territorial statute, and federal law says what you've been doing is criminal. Miss Thornton, arrest warrants for Mr. Cartwright and anyone else involved in this scheme. Federal charges. They can defend themselves in Denver. The explosion of reaction nearly lifted the church roof. Cartwright and the other officials protesting, Bradford shouting about jurisdiction and authority, half the crowd talking at once. Elias moved forward, his hand on his gun, and 2 federal marshals Clara hadn't noticed before stepped out of the shadows. Gentlemen, Monroe's voice cut through the chaos. You can come peacefully, or you can resist and add more charges. Your choice. In the end, they came peacefully. The marshals escorted Cartwright and the other officials out of the church, their hands in irons, their faces showing the first real fear Clara had seen in adults who'd thought themselves untouchable. Bradford tried to leave in the confusion, but Elias caught his arm. Not so fast, counselor. Judge Monroe wants a word about your role in facilitating these contracts. I was acting as legal counsel. Attorney-client privilege. Doesn't apply to criminal conspiracy. Elias's smile was cold. You helped sell children into exploitation. That's not legal advice. That's crime. Bradford was led away, still protesting, and suddenly the church was just townspeople and children and one federal judge who'd traveled from Denver to make power answer for its sins. Monroe returned to his table and sat down heavily, the weight of what he'd just done settling visibly on his shoulders. Miss Thornton, make note. All territorial child labor contracts are hereby suspended pending federal review. Any child currently held under such contracts is to be released immediately and placed under protective custody. The orphanage is to be closed and investigated. Any official found to have participated in this system faces federal prosecution. He looked up at the gathered crowd. This is going to cause problems, political problems, economic problems. People in power are going to be very angry, but that's not your concern. Your concern is these children, making sure they're fed, housed, educated, and protected. Silver Creek started something here. You saw suffering and chose to act. Now I'm asking you to finish what you started. Take care of these kids. Show them what community means. Can you do that? Margaret Chen stood from her pew. We can. We will. Other voices joined hers. The blacksmith, the seamstress, the doctor, even Reverend Walsh finally finding courage to match his rhetoric. One by one, the citizens of Silver Creek committed themselves to the task of rebuilding what corruption had broken. Monroe nodded slowly. Good. Because these children deserve better than what they've gotten. They deserve to be children, to play and learn and grow without fear, to have homes and futures and the chance to become whoever they're meant to be. Give them that. Make it right. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, people gathering around the children, families solidifying commitments, the community organizing itself around purpose. Clara found herself surrounded by Thomas and Annie and Mary, all of them crying and laughing simultaneously, the emotional release of watching justice actually happen. We're really safe, Annie whispered. They really can't take us back. They really can't, Elias confirmed, crouching down to their level. Monroe's order supersedes everything. You're under federal protection now. Anyone tries to hurt you, they answer to federal court. What happens next? Thomas asked. Next? Elias looked around at the chaos of community organizing itself. Next you get to be kids? Go to school. Make friends. Learn what normal feels like. And somewhere in all that, you figure out who you want to become. Clara felt Sarah's hand on her shoulder and looked up. Ready to go home? Home. The word still felt strange in her mouth, but less strange than before. Less impossible. Yes, she said. I'm ready. The weeks that followed felt like learning to breathe after being underwater too long. Federal investigators descended on the territory, unraveling the network of corruption that had been selling children for profit. The orphanage was shut down, its administrators arrested, the remaining children placed in protective custody while better arrangements were made. More children surfaced. The ones who'd been hiding in the hills, the ones working in distant mines, the ones who'd learned to be so invisible they'd almost disappeared completely. 37 total. Silver Creek took them all. It wasn't easy. Some families struggled with traumatized children who didn't know how to accept love. Some placements failed and had to be rearranged. There were setbacks and difficulties and moments when the whole system seemed ready to collapse under the weight of so much damage. But it held. Margaret Chen organized a community fund that grew beyond anyone's expectations. Donations pouring in from across the territory as word spread about Silver Creek's orphans. The church actually became useful, Reverend Walsh coordinating volunteers and resources with surprising efficiency. Even businesses that had initially resisted found themselves contributing, pressure from customers and neighbors, making clear that child welfare wasn't optional. Clara settled into life at Sarah's ranch like a plant finally given proper soil. The nightmares didn't stop immediately, but they became less frequent. Her feet healed. Her hands lost their chemical burns and calluses, becoming the hands of a child who was allowed to be a child. She started school in October, walking into the one-room schoolhouse with her heart hammering and finding Thomas already there, saving her a seat. The teacher, a young woman named Miss Anderson, treated them the same as every other student. No special attention, no pitying looks, just education and expectations and the assumption that they were capable of learning. It was exactly what they needed. Winter came to the desert, bringing cold that cracked the sky and turned morning frost into diamonds scattered across sage. Clara learned to ride horses, to mend fences, to cook meals that didn't taste like fear. She learned that Sarah's rules were actually fair, that discipline could exist without cruelty, that love didn't have to be earned through suffering. She learned to trust, slowly, painfully, with setbacks and doubts and moments of panic when she was certain it would all be taken away. But it wasn't taken away. It stayed. It grew. It became real. The trial happened in Denver in February, a federal case that attracted attention from newspapers across the country. Clara didn't attend. Monroe had decided her written testimony was sufficient, but she followed the reports Sarah read aloud from the papers. Cartwright and 6 other officials convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and child endangerment, sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years in federal prison. Wade Hutchins got 10 years. Attorney Bradford got 7. The territorial government was forced to reform its entire child welfare system, federal oversight, ensuring that what had happened in Silver Creek couldn't happen elsewhere. It wasn't perfect, systems never were, but it was better. Substantively, measurably better. And in Silver Creek, the children grew. Thomas apprenticed with the blacksmith, his natural skill with metalwork earning him praise and a future in a craft he loved. Annie took to business like she'd been born to it, working alongside Margaret Chen and absorbing everything about commerce and negotiation. Danny's lungs healed, his cough fading until he could run and play like other children his age. Mary, who'd been returned by the Hendersons, found a home with the school teacher and discovered she had a gift for words, for taking the pain she'd experienced and transforming it into stories that made people understand. One by one, the invisible children became visible, became real, became valued members of a community that had learned, however imperfectly, that protecting children wasn't optional, it was foundational. 3 years passed like seasons turning, each one bringing change and growth. Clara turned 13, then 14, her body catching up to her age, her voice finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. The girl who'd scrubbed blood from saloon floors became a young woman who could look adults in the eye and demand respect. She still lived with Sarah, though calling it living with didn't capture the reality anymore. Sarah was her mother in every way that mattered, not by blood or law. The adoption papers had been signed 2 years ago, but by choice, by commitment, by the daily decision to show up and love and build something that couldn't be taken away. The ranch prospered. Clara learned the business alongside Sarah, discovering she had a gift for working with horses, for understanding the nonverbal communication between human and animal. They talked about expanding, about breeding, about building something that could support them both, about building a legacy. On a spring morning when Clara was 14, she rode into Silver Creek with Sarah for the weekly supply run. The town had grown, new buildings, new families, the kind of expansion that came when people felt safe investing in the future. The Desert Rose Saloon had been sold and renovated, transformed into a boarding house for families passing through. Walking past it, Clara felt nothing. No fear, no trauma, just acknowledgement that this was where her story had changed, where she'd been seen for the first time and decided to stop being invisible. They stopped at Margaret Chen's store, where Annie was managing the counter with the confidence of someone who knew her worth. "Clara, perfect timing. Got a letter for you. Federal postmark." Clara took the envelope, heavy and official, and felt her stomach drop. Even 3 years later, official government correspondence triggered old fears. But when she opened it, tears blurred her vision. It was from Judge Monroe, a formal letter thanking her for her testimony, informing her that the final appeal had been denied and all convictions upheld. The child labor exploitation system had been dismantled completely. New federal laws were being written based on what had been learned from Silver Creek, protections that would apply across every territory and state. And then, in his own handwriting at the bottom, "You were braver than you knew, Clara. You spoke up when silence was safer. You demanded justice when accepting injustice was easier. You saved lives, not just your own, but countless children who will never know your name. Thank you. From all of us who believe children deserve better, thank you." Clara read it twice, then showed it to Sarah, who read it with tears streaming down her weathered face. Annie leaned over to read too, and soon they were all crying and laughing, customers staring at the scene with confusion, but indulgence. That afternoon, Elias stopped by the ranch. He'd aged in 3 years, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but he still wore the badge, still stood watch over Silver Creek's children. "Heard you got Monroe's letter," he said, settling into the porch chair. "How'd you hear that?" "Small town, news travels." He looked out at the desert stretching to the horizon. "You know what the real victory is? It's not the trials or the convictions or even the law changes. It's this, you, still here, still growing, still becoming whoever you're meant to be." Clara sat beside him, comfortable in the silence. Finally, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest. "Did you ever think we'd make it? Really?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, no. I thought we'd try and fail. Thought power would win like it usually does. But I also thought trying and failing was better than not trying at all." He looked at her. "You proved me wrong. All of you did. Proved that sometimes, when good people stand up and fight back, they actually win." "Not everyone made it," Clara said quietly. "There are children who died in those mines, children who disappeared before we could help them." "I know." His voice was heavy with that knowledge. "We saved the ones we could. Change things so fewer will die in the future. That's not nothing, Clara. But you're right that it's not everything either. We live with that. Honor the ones we couldn't save by protecting the ones we can." Sarah came out with coffee, and they sat together watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. 3 people who'd chosen each other, who'd built a family from shared purpose and stubborn refusal to accept that children were disposable. That night, Clara lay in her bed, Emma's bed, her bed, and thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago. 10 years old and scrubbing blood in a saloon at midnight, making herself invisible, convinced that surviving was the best she could hope for. She'd been so wrong. Survival wasn't the best you could hope for. It was just the beginning. The foundation you built everything else on. Once you survived, once you found people who saw you and valued you and protected you, then you could start actually living. You could go to school and learn. You could make friends and trust them. You could have nightmares and know someone would be there when you woke screaming. You could make mistakes and be forgiven. You could grow and change and become someone you never imagined possible. You could build a life instead of just enduring one. The next day was Sunday, and Sarah drove them into town for church. Clara still wasn't sure about organized religion, too many memories of adults claiming righteousness while doing terrible things. But she liked the community aspect, seeing the other children who'd been saved, watching them grow, bearing witness to their continued existence. After the service, the children gathered outside while their families talked. 37 souls who'd been invisible and chose visibility, who'd survived and chosen to thrive. Thomas showed off his latest metalwork project, an intricate gate he'd designed himself. Annie talked about expanding Chen's store to include mail-order business. Mary read from her latest story, words that captured their shared experience and made it beautiful instead of just painful. And Clara stood among them, surrounded by people who understood, and felt something settle into place in her chest. Not quite happiness. That was still complicated, still threaded through with memory and loss. But contentment, purpose, the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Hey, Clara," Danny Murphy called out, his voice strong and clear, no trace of the chest fever that had nearly killed him. "Race you to the general store?" She was 14 now, too old for running through town like a child, too old for games and laughter and the simple joy of movement, but she ran anyway. They all did. A ragged group of former orphans sprinting down Main Street, laughing as they dodged respectable citizens and startled horses. Adults called after them to slow down, be careful, act their age. They ignored every word, because they'd earned this: the right to run, the right to laugh, the right to be children even though they'd been forced to be adults too soon. They'd survived hell and come out the other side, and if they wanted to run through town like fools, that was their choice to make. Clara reached the general store first, breathing hard, her cheeks flushed. Thomas came in second, Danny third. The others straggled in, all of them grinning and gasping and absolutely perfectly alive. "We should do something," Annie said suddenly. "Something to mark this, to remember." "Remember what?" Mary asked. "That we made it, that we survived and built something better." Annie looked around at all of them. 3 years ago, we were nothing, property, disposal. Now look at us. We're people. We're family. We're proof that the system can be beaten. They stood there in the afternoon sun, a circle of children who'd been broken and chose to heal, who'd been invisible and chose to be seen, who'd been told they didn't matter and proved everyone wrong. "How do we mark it?" Thomas asked. Clara thought for a moment, then said, "We remember the ones who didn't make it, the children who died before we could help them. We carry their names and their stories. We make sure they're not forgotten. And we keep going," Danny added. "We grow up and have families and build lives. We show everyone that children like us, children nobody wanted, we're worth something. We always were." "We tell our story," Mary said quietly. "We write it down. All of it. The bad and the good. So that other children know they can survive too, that there are people who will fight for them." They stood together as the sun began its descent toward the horizon and made themselves a promise: to remember, to honor, to carry forward the lessons learned in blood and tears and stubborn hope, to never let another child be invisible. Years later, when Clara was grown with children of her own, she would return to Silver Creek and see the monument they'd built in the town square. A simple stone marker with the names of every child who died in the territorial labor system, and beneath them a single line: they were seen, they mattered, they are remembered. She would stand there with her daughter, named Sarah, after the woman who'd saved her, and tell the story. All of it. The orphanage and the saloon and the sheriff who'd risked everything. The town that had stepped up when it mattered. The federal judge who'd made power answer for its crimes. The invisible girl who'd learned to demand visibility. And her daughter would listen with wide eyes and ask, "Mama, were you scared?" Clara would think about that question carefully before answering. Every day, every moment, fear was the constant, but I learned something important. Being scared doesn't mean being helpless. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep going even when you're terrified. Keep speaking even when silence is safer. Keep hoping even when hope seems foolish. Did it get better, the fear? Yes, slowly, with help, with people who loved me even when I couldn't love myself, with time and safety and the understanding that I deserved better than what I'd been given. Clara would squeeze her daughter's hand, and with purpose. Once I realized my story could help other children, the fear mattered less, because the work was more important than my comfort. Standing there in the town square, surrounded by the evidence that broken systems could be reformed and broken children could heal, Clara would feel the weight of it all, the loss and the victory, the pain and the purpose, the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. And she would be grateful, not for the suffering that had been real and terrible and unnecessary, but for the strength it had forged, for the people it had brought into her life, for the understanding that even in the darkest places, light could find a way through if someone was brave enough to crack open the door. Silver Creek had cracked open its door, had let light pour into darkness, had chosen, collectively and imperfectly, to do better. And one invisible girl had been seen at last. The story didn't end there, of course. Stories never really end. They just transform into new chapters, new generations, new children learning that they matter. But for Clara Wynne, standing in that town square with her daughter's hand in hers and Sarah's memory in her heart, this felt like completion, like a circle closing, like the final answer to a question she'd been asking since she was 10 years old and scrubbing blood from saloon floors. Do I matter? Am I worth saving? Is there hope for someone like me? The monument answered those questions without words. Yes. Always yes. Every child matters. Every life has worth. Hope is always possible when people choose to act on it. Clara touched the stone marker one last time, her fingers tracing names of children she'd never known but would never forget, and made one final promise. She would keep telling this story, would keep fighting for invisible children, would keep proving that the girl scrubbing floors in the darkness could become the woman standing tall in the light. Because some stories needed to be told, some victories needed to be remembered, some invisible children needed to know that they were seen, that they mattered, that someone out there was fighting for them. Always fighting, always remembering, always believing that every child deserves the chance to become whoever they're meant to be. And in Silver Creek, on a quiet afternoon when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, that belief became more than words. It became truth,